Bună ziua, stimați spectatori și ascultători! Începe briefingul ambasadorului Federației Ruse în România, dedicat Zilei Rusiei, sărbătorite pe data de 12 iunie. După ce se termină discursul domnului ambasador, cei care participă prin platforma Zoom vor avea posibilitatea de a pune întrebări suplimentare apăsând butonul Ridică mână sau Raise Hand. Îi dăm cuvântul excelenței sale, domnului Valerii Cuzmin, ambasador extraordinar și plenipotențiar al Federației Ruse în România.
Доброе утро, good morning, dear colleagues, dear participants of this small briefing devoted to the National Day of the Russian Federation. Today in the morning, evidently, in the focus of public attention in Russia and in the countries surrounding it, in Europe, not yet in America. America is still sleeping. There is a series of pieces of news coming from Ukraine. Yesterday, in the South Donetsk direction, there took place rather fierce fighting. Whether it is Ukrainian counteroffensive or not, only future will show to us more or less adequately. Half a year ago, we were waiting, expecting winter counteroffensive. Later, it was moved to spring. Now, evidently, if it is counteroffensive, it would be summer counteroffensive of Ukrainian army. So, in information of the Russian Ministry of Defense, it is said that having suffered heavy losses the day before, that means on Sunday, Kiev regime reorganized remnants of 23rd and 31st mechanized brigades into separate combined units and launched another offensive operation in South Donetsk direction. Omitting some details which are not of big interest, I will quote that information of Ministry of Defense that the enemy was attacked with a comprehensive fire attack of army, ground attack, and operational tactical aviation, missile troops and artillery, as well as heavy flamethrower systems. As a result of active and self-sacrificing actions of the Vostok group of forces, which displayed courage and heroism, the enemy was stopped and the set tasks defined by the Ukrainian army haven't been achieved. Total losses of Ukrainian armed forces in this direction were over 1,500 Ukrainian servicemen, 28 tanks, including 8 notorious German Leopard tanks, 3 French manufactured AMX-10, if I'm not mistaken, it is called Leclerc, wheeled tanks, and about 109 armored fighting vehicles originating from different NATO countries. This is just as a starter. Later, inevitably, we'll touch upon the issue of constant and more frequent attacks of Ukrainian terrorists on Russian proper territory, in particular in the region of Belgorod, Bryansk, and some other border regions. But to start with, I would like to pass to the international relations, which are going through truly crucial and tectonic shifts in our days. The idea of a country or even a group of countries dominating the world has sunk into oblivion. The world continues to head confidently towards a more just multipolar system, which, as President Vladimir Putin noted during the victory parade on the 9th of May this year, is based on the principles of trust and indivisible security, of equal opportunities for a genuine and free development of all nations and peoples. The countries from the global south and global east prefer to live by their own wits and guided by their core national priorities rather than a self-serving interests of former colonial powers, and are constantly strengthening their positions right before our eyes. The democratization of international life is facilitated by associations of a new type, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, Euro-Asian Economic Union, and some others. In the long run, all that should bring about a more balanced, sustainable, and inclusive international order. The objective trend is outright rejected by the US-led Western minority. In the attempt to achieve global domination, Washington and its satellites do not hesitate to use any means. Acting in line with the logic of the Cold War, they have added liberal doses of ideology to geopolitics. In defiance of the sovereign equality principle that is enshrined in the UN Charter, they are imposing on the international community an artificial division of the whole world into so-called democracies and so-called autocracies. And the West is now seeking to replace the UN-centric world that took shape after the Second World War with some kind of rules-based global order. The Western elites seek to internationalize these rules, which no one has ever seen and which, by definition, can't be legally binding. Their goal is clear, and it is to destroy the existing international legal system and to hold back development of new world centers in the hope of being able to stick to their colonial policies. And they continue to deal with their issues at other countries' expense. Washington has purposefully destroyed the European security architecture for years on end, as it remained focused on creating threats that were unacceptable for Russia. The United States withdrawal from ABM treaties about 20 years ago, the INF Treaty and the Treaty of Open Skies are among those threats. In fact, reckless NATO eastward expansion is reminiscent of Hitler's Drang nach Osten policy, that is, drive or push towards the east. The Western politicians' true intentions once again transpired in December 2021, when Washington and Brussels once again rejected Russia's proposals to provide our country with legally binding security guarantees. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which sets forth the right of states for self-defense, were compelled to use it to carry out a special military operation in Ukraine. It was also necessary to step in order to eliminate security threats created by NATO along our border and prevent the extermination of people whose ancestors have lived in this land for centuries, in the cities founded by Russia centuries ago. On the 21st of March this year, President Putin has approved new concept of foreign policy of the Russian Federation. I dare quote a couple of points out of it for your better understanding of the priorities and strategic national interests of Russian Federation. This document underscores more than 1,000 years of independent statehood, the cultural heritage of the preceding era, deep historical ties with the traditional European culture and other Eurasian cultures, and the ability to ensure harmonious coexistence of different peoples, ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups on one common territory, which has been developed over the centuries, determine Russia's special position as a unique country civilization and a vast Euro-Asian, Euro-Pacific power that brings together the Russian people and other peoples belonging to the culture and civilizational community of the Russian world. Humanity is currently going through revolutionary changes. The crisis of economic globalization is deepening. Current problems, including the energy market and financial sector, are caused by degradation of many previous development models and instruments, irresponsible macroeconomic solutions, including uncontrolled emission and accumulation of unsecured debts, illegal unilateral restrictive measures, and unfair competition. How do you like blowing up 3 out of pipelines of Nord Stream 1 and 2? A fair competition? Considering the strengthening of Russia as one of the leading centers of development in the modern world, its independent policy as a threat to Western hegemony, the United States of America and their satellites used the measures taken by Russian Federation as regards to Ukraine to protect its vital interests as a pretext to aggravate the long-standing anti-Russian policy and unleashed a new type of a hybrid war. This was not the choice of the Russian Federation. Russia does not consider itself to be enemy of the West and is not isolating itself from the West and has no hostile intentions in regard to it. Nevertheless, in response to unfriendly actions of the West, Russia intends to defend its right to existence and freedom of development using all means available. The majority of humanity is interested in having constructive relations with Russia and in strengthening Russian positions in the international scene as an influential global power, making a decisive contribution to maintaining global security and ensuring peaceful development of states. I believe that up to now, this rather conceptual document, which is the basis for strategic planning in our foreign policy planning in our country, has been dealt due attention and analysis, but just brushed away. Nevertheless, it is one of the starting points in the current period of time, so that to understand better Russian policy. I would stop short of retelling other major parts of this rather big document. Just if you don't mind, I believe it is of special interest, it should be of special interest to you. But to quote the article of this concept devoted directly to European region. Most European states pursue an aggressive policy towards Russia, aimed at creating threats to the security and sovereignty of the Russian Federation, gaining unilateral economic advantages, undermining domestic political stability, and eroding traditional Russian spiritual and moral values, creating obstacles to Russia's cooperation with allies and partners. In this connection, the Russian Federation intends to consistently defend its national interests by giving priority attention to, first, reducing and neutralizing threats to security, territorial integrity, sovereignty, traditional spiritual and moral values, and socio-economic development of Russia, its allies and partners from unfriendly European states, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European Union, and the Council of Europe. Point 2, creating conditions for cessation of unfriendly actions by the European states and their associations, for a complete rejection of an anti-Russian cause, including interference into Russian internal affairs by the states and their associations, and for their transition to a long-term policy of good neighborliness, mutually beneficial cooperation with Russia. The formation of a new model of coexistence by European states to ensure the safe, sovereign, and progressive development of Russia, its allies and partners, and durable peace in the European part of Eurasia. The main factor complicating normalization of relations between Russia and European states is the strategic course of the United States of America. I call them United States of amnesia, and their individual allies to draw and deepen dividing lines in the European region in order to weaken and undermine the competitiveness of the economies of Russia and its and European states, as well as to limit the sovereignty of European states and ensure US global domination. And finally, briefly, a part devoted to US and other Anglo-Saxon states. Russia's course towards the US has a combined character, taking into account the role of the state as one of the influential sovereign centers of the world, and at the same time, the main inspirer, organizer, and executor of the aggressive anti-Russian policy of the collective West, the source of major risks to the security of the Russian Federation, international peace, a balanced, equitable, and progressive development of humanity. Russian Federation, nevertheless, is interested in maintaining strategic parity, peaceful coexistence with the United States, and the establishment of a balance of interests between Russia and the United States, taking into account the status, American status of a major, together with Russia, of course, of major nuclear powers, and special responsibility for strategic stability and international security in general. Briefly, it is theoretical part of our preamble. For your better understanding, I would like to remind a couple of half a dozen, more properly, half a dozen of major Russian foreign policy demarches, decisions, and steps during the recent year. It was back in September 2022 when President Putin signed a decree approving the concept of humanitarian policy of the Russian Federation abroad. The concept reflects Russia's national interest in the humanitarian sphere and prescribes the main goals, objectives, and principles of humanitarian policy. On the 30th of September last year, the ceremony of signing treaties on the admission to Russia, to Russian Federation, it is properly, it should be said, of the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, Zaporozhskaya and Khersonskaya regions, and the formation of new 4 subjects of the Russian Federation took place in Kremlin, in Moscow. As Russian President Vladimir Putin noted on that occasion, the new subjects of Federation realized their rights according to the UN Charter, which states the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. On the 21st of February this year already, 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia suspends its participation in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, so-called START III treaty. The reason for this decision was the hybrid war unleashed by the Western countries against Russia, as well as the course taken by them to inflict strategic defeat to our country. He stated that a significant violation by the American side of the provisions of the treaty led to a radical change in the security environment, both in Europe and globally. The same day, but in March, President Putin held talks in Kremlin with President of China, Xi Jinping, A package of documents was signed, including a joint statement on deepening comprehensive partnership relations and strategic cooperation entering a new era, and the joint statement on the development plan for key areas of Sino-Russian economic cooperation through 2030. The trade turnover between Russia and China in 2022 reached a historical record of $185 billion and can be significantly increased through export of Russian agricultural goods to China. On the 21st of March, President Putin signed the decree on approval of the foreign policy concept, which has been already mentioned. On the 9th of May, following the ending of military parade on the Red Square, President Putin, together with leaders of foreign states who arrived to Moscow to celebrate 78th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War, laid flowers at the tomb of an unknown soldier in Alexander Garden besides the Kremlin wall. He was accompanied by the presidents of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Armenian Prime Minister. Next day, on the 10th of May, Vladimir Putin submitted a bill to the State Duma on the denunciation of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. The treaty was signed in 1990, but NATO members didn't ratify the adapted version of this treaty after dismantling of Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, and so on. That is, ignoring new geopolitical realities in our continent. The actual number of armaments in the NATO countries exceeded the quotas assigned in those documents. For many years, the treaty actually didn't work and was contrary to Russian security interests. More than that, not a single NATO state ratified the adapted treaty, as I have mentioned, and the only group of countries which really ratified it, led by Russia, was a number of members of Collective Security Treaty Organization, like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and some others. On the 18th of May, the Black Sea Initiative on the export of Ukrainian grain and Russia-UN Memorandum of Normalization of Russian agricultural exports were renewed for another 2-month period until July 17th this year. The initiative was previously extended in November 2022 for 120 days and in March 2023 for 60 days. However, due to the destructive and politicized position of unfriendly states, these agreements were not fully implemented. The Russian food and even donation of fertilizers free of charge continues to be blocked in the European seaports. Only minor cargo ships were allowed to reach a couple of African countries recently, but generally situation remains frozen. Let us move to the economy and bilateral relations, I believe. It's high time. Last year, 2022, Russian economy was facing unprecedented challenges and threats due to those already mentioned unilateral, illegitimate from the standpoint of international law, one-sided restrictions, which are called in the West sanctions. Though legally only Security Council of the United Nations is eligible to take decisions about international sanctions. And nevertheless, GDP of Russia, in spite of all negative forecasts and predictions, decreased only by 2.1%. And according to the data available on the sites of World Bank and National Statistical Services of different countries, in last year, Russian economy, gaining 3 points, moved to the 8th place in the top 10 largest economies of the world, with the volume of gross domestic product of $2.3 trillion. This happened for the first time after some period of 5 or 7 even years. Unfortunately, I can't provide you with a completely correct figure. In 2022, foreign debt of the Russian Federation decreased to the level of 16.6 of GDP, which is the minimal level starting from the early years 2000. Just for the sake of comparison, debt of the United States of America, state debt of the United States of America, is 121.7% of GDP. On average in Eurozone, it is 90%, almost 91%. In the Netherlands, it is 380%. In Germany, 66.5%. In France, over 110%. Better index, better result shown in the world, better than Russian result of 16.6, has only People's Republic of China, which has only 15.4% to GDP level of the state debt. The Russian Federation is enlarging geography of free trade agreements. Talks are approaching finalization with Iran. Work is going with Egypt, Indonesia, United Arab Emirates, and many other countries. Special attention is paid to realization of strategic project of international transport corridor north-south, which is going to link Russia with Iran and India. And recently, there was signed a Russian-Iranian agreement to build the remaining stretch of railway of about 100 and something kilometers between points of Astara and Resht. The first one in Azerbaijan, and the rest is located in Iran. Among the major results of foreign trade in Russia last year, we should mention that external trade turnover rose by 8.1% year to year to the 2021, and it reached the level of $850.5 billion. Profit of trade balance reached $332 billion. The volume of exports increased by 19.9% to $591.5 billion. Import decreased by 11.7% to $259 billion. Information of Federal Customs Service shows us that during the year, Russia increased exports of mineral fuel, oil products, and other byproducts by 42.8% to the level of $383.7 billion. Increase is registered in export of agricultural goods. Substantial increase of 14.8%. Export of fertilizers rose by 54.3%. All those figures are, of course, counted not by physical volume, but by the value of those goods. During the Russian-Chinese Business Forum in Shanghai a couple of weeks ago, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin noted that inflation in Russia in May slowed down to the level of 2.3 in annual calculation. More than that, some agricultural goods became cheaper, though this decrease is rather modest. Till now it is 0.2%. But evidently this is a positive sign showing healthy trends gaining upper hand in the medium-term and long-term run. Central Bank of Russia issued a prognosis, a forecast that at the outcome of the second quarter this year, GDP of our country is expected to rise by 4.2% year to year to the previous 2021. What is interesting, starting from March, it is registered noticeable increase in industrial production in Russia, starting from relatively modest 1.2% in March, going to 5.2% in April, and keeping this trend in the following period, though data for May is not yet available. The major, so to say, driving force in that trend was increase of the volume of production of manufacturing industry, about 8% in annual calculation. Maximum increase showed the sector of ready-made metallic products, about 30%, electric equipment, over 29%, automobiles, trailers, and others, over 27%, computer and computer periphery, over 23%, and some others. Yes, of course, there are problems, for example, in such sectors as wood production and machines, metallurgical and mining equipment, agricultural equipment, by the way, as well, and pharmaceuticals. There is, as now I often hear in Romania, a negative growth is registered. But nevertheless, Russian government pursues a consistent policy of import substitution, and along with the realization of this strategy, we believe that in those sectors as well, improvement is quite achievable. As for oil and gas sector, yes, indeed, production, or better to say export, it is more correctly, export of Russian natural gas last year decreased by almost a third, 30.7%. It was equal to 170 billion cubic meters. But as far as prices soared, the growth in this sector reached 88%, more by $23.5 billion of revenues were brought by that export. And as a result, revenues of incomes of Russian state budget rose almost 1.5 times. In spite of evident problems we have briefly mentioned in the pipeline gas exports, it could be stated with satisfaction that last year considerably increased production of the liquefied gas in Russia, and it reached, the volume of this production reached 32.5 million tons, which is an equivalent of 45 billion cubic meters. Majorly, that liquefied gas was exported into 11 countries of European Union. France, about 34%, Spain, over 26%, Netherlands, about 20%, and Belgium. As a result of substantial increase in prices, revenues as well jumped up, and estimations of our experts show that by 2030, production of liquefied natural gas in Russia would triple up to about 100 million tons, equivalent of 138 billion cubic meters. Passing by a couple of points, I would like to make a short stopover on the topic of Euro-Asian Economic Union, which celebrates this year its 20th anniversary. Russia has assumed presidency in this union this year. And late in May, there was a regular and jubilee session of Supreme Euro-Asian Economic Council, which is ruling body of this union, including heads of states and governments of the member countries. Speaking at this forum, President Putin mentioned that trade turnover between the countries of Euro-Asian Economic Union last year increased by 14%, reaching the level of $83.3 billion. He underscored necessity of development of industrial cooperation, developing new joint ventures under the joint trademark made in Euro-Asian Economic Union, spoke about great demand for consolidation of technological self-reliance and sovereignty, of digital sovereignty in Euro-Asian Economic Union. And of course, there was mentioned great need to strengthen financial sovereignty of the member states of Euro-Asian Economic Union through securing sustainable banking and financial transfer infrastructure, which is now a controversial, if you like, sphere of international economic relations. Putin suggested a new direction in the improvement and perfection of the cooperation of the countries members to the Union, he suggested to develop the fifth liberty, the fifth freedom, besides freedom of movement of goods, services, finances, and human capital. Fifth freedom of knowledge, which would be based on the common principles and standards of education, public health service, and government administration. It would be contributing to formation, to creation of common cultural space. And if you like, these are quote unquote the words of Putin, of common Euro-Asian ideology, which is very important for the younger generation. At this background, economic relations between Russia and Romania was quite in the trend, though I remember that early this year, our approximative forecast of the volume of trade was counted in dollars, and I was speaking about 4.9, maybe even $5 billion. Finally, we can state that it was 4.3 billion euro. That means about $4.7 billion, which is lower level than in the previous 2021. The fall was about 12%. Export of Russian Federation was equivalent to $3.9 billion euro. Sorry, we're switching to euro. And import was 400 million euro. That means 0.4 billion euro. As a result, for Russia, deficit of trade balance was about $3.5 billion euro. Evidently, that many sanctions exactly in the major sector of our trade cooperation, which is oil products and natural gas. Last year it was 3 billion euro worth. We introduced those restrictions, were introduced towards the end of the year, and evidently effect of them would be felt later. But nevertheless, we can say that besides those articles of natural mineral fuel, Romania was importing rolled metal, fertilizers. The largest point after fuel was fertilizers, in fact, then rolled metal, and some industrial equipment. All in all, I have told you the total sum of those deals and transactions. As for Russia, Romanian export was lower by 2/3, about 60% lower than in 2021. And the major items of Romanian export to Russia were traditionally car spare parts, automobile spare parts and components, cosmetics, medicines, some others. As a response to the unilateral restricting measures of European Union, completely supported by Romania, Russian government introduced some measures as well, like raising the customs duties and prohibition of imports of certain groups of goods. As a result, there is a kind of analysis of our economists. An overall result was a disruption of certain supply chains, which before provided goods with the estimated value of about $200 million. Well, I believe that some consequences are well felt and visible in Romania. As for Russia, I have already gave you a description of trends and problems in our domestic economy. Evidently, that Russian strategy now is oriented majorly to weaken, if not to rid of any influence, negative influence to our economy of the unfriendly actions of foreign states, including, first of all, depolitization and provision of independent, or better to say, accessibility of independent international payment infrastructure, which is, for example, one of the major obstacles in the way of Russian cereal and fertilizers exports to the most needy countries in the African continent, because hypocritical stand of the Western governments could be described as denial of any bans and restrictions on agricultural export, but introduction of all kinds of restrictions and problems in, for example, banking system, insurance system, or not to forget about a notorious ban for any Russian commercial vessels to enter European ports. Some of them, by the way, found themselves blocked in those ports, carrying fertilizers for Africa, for example. Such minor things do not bother neither the hegemon, neither its vassals in Europe. So we are, of course, interested in diversification of non-energetic, non-energy, non-fuel exports, geographic diversification of economic relations with the foreign countries. And what is underscored in all our conceptual documents, we remain open for pragmatic cooperation with the business circles in the unfriendly states. Though, of course, we are going to introduce special economic measures as a response to unfriendly, unfair competition, unfriendly policies of the Western countries. And the final, if you like, remark in this regard, in general, in spite of some negative trends that I have tried to tell you about in our bilateral economic relations, we believe that reconstruction or rebuilding of pragmatic economic cooperation between Russia and Romania in the Black Sea region could be of big interest for both states. As for other fields, spheres of our relations, political field is completely, comprehensively described by the formula of unfriendly towards Russia policy of NATO and European Union, to which Romanian state shows 100% commitment. So there is nothing to say about substantial political dialogue, for example, though embassy and our foreign ministry consistently tries to inform Romanian diplomatic service and parliament, for example, about the major decisions of our government and parliamentarians on different issues, starting from biological laboratories of the United States and Ukraine, and coming to issues of strategic security, arms control, and others. And of course, some aspects of developments in Ukraine. But nevertheless, just taking advantage of a coincidence, today we have United Nations Russian Language Day, which is remembered every year, starting from 2010. This day is the day of birth of our great poet Alexander Pushkin. But I can state that in Romania, where on the official calendar there is almost 24 of days devoted to language and culture of different national minorities, there is no day of Russian language and culture. And it is not a result of a special operation or something like that. It is just non-existent. So I believe that in spite of all those problems, the day will come when our humanitarian, cultural, artistic, musical cooperation as well would revive. And on the official calendar of Romania, there will be a day of Russian language and culture. This is more or less all on our bilateral relations, and I believe that if there are questions, we'll try to answer to them. But frankly, hardly something substantial could be added to this brief review of mine. Recently, we have been eyewitnesses of substantial escalation of tension, including military activities, and in particular, terrorist activities of the Kiev regime. And evidently, as far as we can judge from your questions and from mass media and political declarations we are acquainted of here in Romania. And I would like to bring you the not so short, but to my mind, very eloquent quotation story of this major conflict in our European continent, of course, provided by President Vladimir Putin only a few days ago, after the, so to say, multiple drone attack on Moscow civilian targets. He was asked about it by a regular citizen, and what he said: during the time that Ukraine was emerging as an independent state, from the very beginning, from the first step, it declared itself a neutral state. It is written in its Declaration of Independence. In 2008, without any external signs, without any military, it was even before a so-called Georgian war, or as we call it, peace enforcement operation in southern Ossetia. In 2008, without any external signs, without any military and political tension, they announced that they were joining NATO. They wanted to join NATO. And the Western countries, the alliance members, at the summit of NATO in Bucharest, by the way, announced that doors of alliance were open to Ukraine. Not only we were cheated and told that there would be no NATO expansion to the east, but then they also reached Ukraine. In 2014, they carried out a coup d'etat and simply began to destroy everyone who, one way or another, wanted to build normal relations with Russia. He is speaking about Ukrainian authorities. They also unleashed a war and military operations in Donbass. Russia was forced to respond to the war Ukrainian regime unleashed in Donbass by launching the special military operation. In particular, because once more, they deceived us, trying to keep our guard down, declaring that they wanted to resolve the issue through peaceful means. And now we have all kinds of confessions of political leaders, actively German leaders, French leaders, who were participating in working out well-known Minsk Accords in 2015, that they were just aiming to gain time to have enough opportunities to strengthen political and more military potential of Ukraine, so that to fight Russia. So what is the difference between us? We are striking at the territory of Ukraine, but with long-range precision weapons, at military infrastructure facilities only, either at ammunition, fuel, or lubricants warehouses used for combat operations. We talked about the possibility of striking decision-making centers, goes on Mr. Putin. The quarters of Ukrainian military intelligence, which is, I can add, located on the island in the Dnieper River, not far from Kiev, evidently is one of such decision-making centers. And the Russian army carried out a strike at this target just in the end of May. In response, Kiev regime has chosen a different path, attempts to intimidate Russian citizens with strikes at residential buildings. This is an obvious terrorist approach. Moscow air defense system responded properly. However, we're even so much concerned about this as over the attempts to trigger a Russian response. Apparently, they are provoking us into responding in a like manner, in the same manner. We will have to consider it now, how to approach this. Of course, Ukrainian citizens cannot speak out because of the total terror against civilians in this country. Yet they should know where the current leaders of Ukraine are pushing the country. There are other threats as well. For instance, attempts to disrupt the operation of Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or use dirty nuclear devices. Today we learned then that Kakhovka major hydroelectrical station dam is partially destroyed by Ukrainian shelling. And of course, immediately, Kiev propaganda, which is working by the British, by the way, manual, started to cry that it was Russians who destroyed this dam. What for, my dear friends? I'm sorry, I'm not going to dig too deep into details, but it is completely absurd assumption, or better to say accusation, not more reasonable than accusation of Russians for blowing up the Nord Stream gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea. But No creative, you see, ability shown by Western propaganda in this case as well. Once speaking at the Council of Inter-Ethnic Relations, Putin made a couple of interesting remarks, which I like to share with you. Our adversaries have decided that Russia's multi-ethnicity is a tender sport, and they are making every effort to divide us and shamelessly declare the need for so-called decolonization of Russia. My comment is, and these are people, descendants of the nations, eliminating whole continent population, for example, in North America, of red-skinned Indians. Numbers differ, but they were dozens of millions of them. They have disappeared or pushed into reservations, a kind of slow extermination camps. And those people are speaking about decolonization of Russia, where not a single ethnicity disappeared through imperial, Soviet, and recent time. I said earlier, continued Putin, that people who are guided by neo-colonial ideas are half-wits, and they would come in second place in a contest, in a competition of half-wits. Why second? Because they're half-wits. They fail to understand that faced with external aggression and external pressure, our multi-ethnic nation is only getting stronger. It is not by chance, I want to emphasize this, said Putin, that almost all the peoples of Russia have joined the ranks of the fighters in the special military operation or volunteered to help on the home front. As of now, representatives of over 100 ethnic groups living in Russia have been decorated with high military awards. The stronger sanctions, the nastier the slander, the higher this manifestation of general consideration, underscored Putin. Over the past 5 years, this measurement has grown by a third. And by the beginning of 2023, it exceeded 94%. According to unbiased statistics, in 2017, only 63% of Russian citizens identified themselves primarily as Russians. And afterwards, according to the ethnic, so to say, appropriation. And in 2022, this number of those people in Russia who identify themselves primarily as Russians grew to the level of 94.2%. Now for some distraction, I'll bring you a couple of news from United States of America, which are still sleeping now on the opposite side of our planet. On the 25th of May, a little bit more than a week ago, CNN, that can't be suspected in any way of any sympathies to Russia, or I don't know, to the enemies of America, published results of the public opinion polls showing that 66% of American voters would call a victory of Biden in the future presidential elections in 2024 a catastrophe or disaster for the United States of America. Another, evidently not Kremlin agent, not Kremlin propaganda outlet, roughly at the same day, TV corporation NBC, American one as well, referring to a document presented in court, reported that the driver of a van that had smashed into fence not far from the White House in Washington, D.C., District Columbia, confessed to the authorities that he intended to kill President of the United States and seize power. This is our world, tense, hostile, and unfortunately rather fragile. To be serious, there are people, sober-minded people, who are trying to expressed their alarm about the trends we are facing now in the context at the background of Ukrainian crisis as well. For example, an author of the Responsible Statecraft, it is a social media, I believe, outlet, Jan Davis informs that the latest meeting of the so-called NATO Military Committee took place on the 10th of May in Brussels last month. Parliamentarians and publics are being kept in dark about one of the most opaque but consequential processes within NATO, underscores this author. At the Vilnius summit in July, NATO political leaders will be asked to approve thousands of pages of secret military plans that will detail for the first time since the Cold War how the alliance would respond to Russian attack. Most of these plans were drawn up behind closed doors by permanent military representatives of NATO headquarters in Brussels, and other NATO and national defense officials, without prior scrutiny by parliamentary bodies and independent experts. In a press conference after the meeting, the chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, a lieutenant admiral in the Royal Netherlands Navy, described it as a historic because of the unparalleled integration of NATO and national military planning. And this will enable the alliance, continued Rob Bauer, to do exactly what the NATO flag symbolizes. We will follow the same compass. A compass, adds the author, is often regarded as a fail-safe piece in a kit. But as any hiker knows, you also need a map and a very clear idea as to what should happen under your feet as you walk on your compass bearing. I am not going to dig too deep into the details. It is mentioned, and it was already last year that NATO alliance agreed to put 300,000 troops on high alert along the borders of Russia, up from the previous level of 40,000. That means increased it 8 times. If these plans to be fully implemented, continues Jan Davis, yes, exactly. I'm still not so bad to remember this name. So this will be a path from which it will be difficult to deviate because so many really important decisions would be taken. The European Union diplomacy boss, Joseph Borrell, notorious for his neo-colonialist formula, European garden surrounded by the jungles, recently announced that he knows very well how to stop war in Ukraine. According to him, it's just enough to stop Western support, majorly supplies of arms, and almost overnight it will be over. But the Ukraine, of course, will immediately be defeated, humiliated, oppressed, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. In the same time, NATO leaders, on many different occasions, at almost all levels, have been since last year spring, the last but one now already spring, we're speaking about Russia should be defeated on the battlefield. Summarizing, European Union and NATO under command of Washington hasn't withdrawn their bid in this dangerous gamble. They are speaking about Ukraine being best American and EU investment because Russians are killed, bloodshed going non-stop, Being unable to launch counteroffensive, Kyiv escalates terrorist activities, enjoying full Western support. In this regard, it is relevant to quote Deputy Chairman of Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, our former president as well, who told reporters during his recent visit to Vietnam, there are some irreversible rules of war. If it comes to deliveries of nuclear weapons, and now we see escalation, they started from Javelin, anti-tank, manual, in fact, weapons, arms, and now they're speaking about F-16 fighters. So a preemptive strike will have to be carried out, continues Medvedev. In his opinion, the West will still fails to grasp this and believes that this will not happen. The United States operates largely within the field of its pragmatic interests. They do not wage a war. They are making money instead. They are trying to eliminate their centuries-long enemy, Medvedev continued. As far as Europe is concerned, it's a strange story for me. They keep heating up tensions with their decisions. Europe has gone mad. Whether it is correct or not, let us have a look at the recent declarations of Foreign Minister of Great Britain, James Cleverly, who said literally, commenting or answering some questions, I believe, after a speech he has given in Estonia. In his speech, he spoke about deterring Vladimir Putin's aggression and so on and so forth. And he elaborated, Ukraine doesn't have the legitimate right to defend itself. It has the legitimate right to do so within own borders, of course. Sorry, Ukraine does have the legitimate right to defend itself. It has the legitimate right to do so within its own borders, of course. But it does also have the right to project force beyond its borders, to undermine Russia's ability to project force into Ukraine itself. So legitimate military targets beyond its own border are part of Ukraine's self-defense. And we should recognize that. That is not to say that I have any particular assessment over the attacks in Moscow. It is about drone attacks, which we have already mentioned. But more broadly, military targets beyond its own borders are internationally recognized as being legitimate part of a nation's self-defense. He spoke about Kyiv's actions and intentions. Well, make note, it is eloquently expressed NATO position. Don't complain afterwards about the Russian response. I believe that any reasonable and sober-minded observer, as well not suffering from selective amnesia, which is widespread disease in the NATO countries, should have well asked Mr. Cleverly, why don't you deny, sir, the same right of Russia for self-defense after multiple attempts and initiatives for peaceful and political settlement of emerging risks and threats to its security posed by the Atlantic Alliance expansion to the east and directly to our borders. To have a better understanding with whom we're dealing with in Ukraine, I would like to bring you a small quotation of the Special Training Commander for European Union Military Assistance Mission in support of Ukraine, Andreas Marlow from Germany. Please.
Die Ausbildung, die sich im Zusammenhang
Немецкие инструкторы, работавшие с украинцами, сходятся во мнении, что программа обучения их не интересует. Гораздо больше интерес для них представляют способы устрашения противника, включая те, которые могут быть квалифицированы как военные преступления. Они восхваляют карательные операции, которые проводили войска СС во время Второй мировой, демонстрируют свастику.
Well, I believe quite eloquent and brief description of harsh reality. Another eyewitness statement from a former American Marines intelligence officer, Scott Ritter, who said recently in his Twitter that in Ukraine, a de facto Nazi regime has been established, and this encourages encourages strikes against civilians of the Donbass. I think Americans need to understand, writes Scott Ritter, that we are fighting on the side of bad guys for the Nazis who commit terrible crimes. Ritter noted as well that the Kiev regime favors strikes on the area where shops and schools are located, which leads to numerous casualties among the civilians. He has also exposed the fact that we are talking about deliberate shelling, since the armed forces of Ukraine have not only NATO's weapons, but intelligence data collected by American side as well. In this regard, it is, I would say, relevant to mention such minor things, seemingly minor, that, for example, employees of the Ukrainian State Service for Disaster Medicine, which is part of the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, secretly remove organs from the bodies of soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine. This was stated by a representative of the Russian law enforcement agencies, citing a source in Kherson medical facilities. You can't keep information about those crimes air and watertight, hermetically tight. It leaks outside. After a surgical intervention, this information says, the bodies of the fighters of the armed forces of Ukraine are burned in a hospital crematorium. At the same time, relatives receive certificates of a missing person. Well, in the framework of his recent fourth voyage to Africa, being in South African capital, I believe, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov answered the following question. The West is increasing supply of weapons to Ukraine. How does Russia evaluate such aggressive steps? Quote, Sergei Lavrov, the West's statement that the weapons supplied to Kyiv should not be used against the territory of Russian Federation is another lie. Threats to kill Russians came from many officials of the Kyiv regime, including the Secretary of the Security Council, including an advisor of the head of the Zelensky administration, including several Ukrainian ambassadors abroad. The conclusion is extremely simple. The West is supporting genocide directly. Genocide of Russians, of course, in this particular case. So, many questions are related to the issue how to find the way out of this great calamity, great tragedy that is unrolling in Ukraine. And I would bring you a couple of details in this regard, though, of course, for the moment, this question has no definite and concrete answer for different reasons, which will be clear to you by the end of our talk. Russia shares the position that Ukrainian conflict should not be frozen. This statement was made a few days ago by Press Secretary of President of Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov. In this regard, Russia is in solidarity with the West, mentioned Dmitry Peskov. Russia is only considering the possibility of completing a special military operation. That means ensuring its interests, achieving Russia's goals either through a special military operation or by other available means, he stressed. Answering the question about the plans for peaceful settlement of this conflict, he elaborated, it's too early to talk about it, there are obviously no preconditions for peace. Any kind of negotiations are forbidden in Ukraine itself. We remember that notorious decree of President Zelensky dated last autumn, by which he prohibited himself from dealing with Putin and talking with him about any settlements or any other problems. We could borrow some details from a recent interview of Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Mikhail Galuzin, to TASS agency, which was majorly devoted to the notorious counteroffensive to which West is pushing Ukraine. Russian senior diplomat noted that Russia's approach to settling the conflict around Ukraine remains the same. It involves defending the people of Donbass, the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, and the elimination of threats to Russia's security emanating from its territory. We are confident that the settlement is possible only with a complete cessation of military action by Ukrainian troops and the Western arms supplies, cessation of Western arms supplies. In order to achieve comprehensive, fair, and stable peace, Ukraine must return to its neutral, non-aligned status enshrined in its 1990 State Sovereignty Declaration and refuse to join NATO and the EU, Galuzin stressed. He added that protection of the rights of Russian speakers and ethnic minorities, including Romanian minority, is an essential element of the peace settlement. The state status of the Russian language should be fixed in the at the legislative level. It is necessary to achieve observance of fundamental human rights in Ukraine, including the right to freedom of religion. What is going on with freedom of religion? I don't want to just take too much time of you. We have spoken more than once in our comments, in our information in this regard. It is a disaster, systemic reprisals against the only canonical Orthodox Church in this country. Seizure of Kievo-Pechorskaya Lavra, many churches by the militants, by evidently Satanists in the terms of their convictions, in the terms of their conscience, and hooligans and terrorists in the terms of their practical actions, intimidating people coming to pray in those churches, beating them, intimidating and beating clergymen, arresting some of them, like, for example, Archbishop Paul, who is the chief cleric in the, who was the chief cleric because he was put under house arrest, and in fact, Sergei-Pechorskaya Lavra is occupied by Ukrainian authorities, by security service, with automatic rifles, and so on and so forth. As for the future elements of settlement in Ukraine, of course, it should be added that reunification of the Crimea and Sevastopol, of other 4 new constituent members of the Russian Federation is not negotiable, because not because Russia is so despotic or dictatorial, tyrannic nation, because those, first of all, those decisions were born in painstaking, self-sacrificing fight against that neo-Nazis comprehensive assault against everything Russian and everything patriotic, for example, anti-fascist in this country. And by the way, not once, in some newly emerging peace initiatives, they say, let us rerun referendums in those regions to find out whether they were willing or not. They were willing. In Donetsk and Lugansk, for example, the first referendums took place in April 2014. They were exactly the pretext used by the central Kiev authorities to launch, at that time they called it anti-terrorist operation. But in fact, it was a full-scale war against the people's militias, against the civilian population, with murders, mass rapes, with unknown graves still waiting the moment when they will be discovered later on the territory under control of the Kiev armed forces and nationalist, in fact, neo-Nazi battalions. So they don't need any rerunning or reorganization, any confirmation of their decision. This decision is for them crucial and definitive, because otherwise they do not see any opportunities for survival. Well, biological laboratories of the United States in Ukraine, it is another major topic. Gradually, more and more facts become public. Recently, Parliamentary Investigation Commission in Russian Parliament finished up a certain stage of its work and produced a report on 450 pages. We have received the text of this report and we are sending it to Romanian Parliament, to both chambers, to the chairs of the both chambers, in very brief summarizing, if you like, of that report. There are more and more facts, which are, by the way, confirmed by certain Americans. We'll come back to the Americans a little bit later, showing that dangerous research was carried out in those biolaboratories, not only to study, but to perfect, to increase the poisonous, detrimental, pathogenic effect of many bacteria, viruses, and diseases already known or not yet well known to the medical science. And special attention was paid to genetic specificities study of population of Eastern Ukraine. Avoiding many details and so on, we should say as well that parliamentarians, they do not claim that they are criminal investigators. They say that the whole case of biological laboratories in Ukraine and research carried out by them should be the subject of investigation, criminal investigation properly. But what is clear, that it is evident breach of relevant international conventions. It is clear that it had no peaceful goals and aims to be achieved. And it evidently should be made known to the whole mankind, so that to prevent any dangerous consequences from activities of such laboratories, not only in Ukraine. Dozens of them, they exist in other countries, but outside territory of the United States of America. Suddenly, very recently, just today in the morning, there came a piece of news about United States presidential hopeful Robert Kennedy Jr., nephew of JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, late president of the United States, assassinated president of the United States, who was speaking in particular during one of his meetings with the journalists, I believe, about biological laboratories in Ukraine. No, sorry. It was in conversation with United States businessman Elon Musk that was webcast on Twitter. Robert Kennedy Jr. said that US laboratories are located all around the world, including Ukraine, and are developing all kinds of biological weapons. Full stop, I believe. So, more or less, we have some, by the way, more detailed account of an interview with Fox News of the same presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy Jr. He speaks about American authorities lying to the American nation about the true goals of American involvement in Ukraine. They told us that we came to Ukraine for humanitarian purposes, with humanitarian motivations. But it has become clear that they were pursuing completely different aims. Their aim was change of regime and weakening the Russians. Ukrainians found themselves in a trap of proxy conflict between the two superpowers, affecting, or better to say, leading to the hundreds of thousands young Ukrainians perishing in those battles. In particular, he claims that, according to certain information available to Mr. Robert Kennedy Jr., it is already over or around 350,000 Ukrainians have been killed at the front line. So I believe that it is quite eloquent, and for the moment it is enough for us to understand what is going on. There is a new, evidently extremely dangerous turn in the activities of Kiev regime. We have already mentioned this half-abortive counteroffensive which started in the South Donetsk direction. But the previous days, we were following a series of failed, thanks God, but continuous attacks of the European terrorists at the Russian territory in Belgorod region, following the similar attacks that took place against Bryansk border regions and some others. In the hotbed, in the focus of those terrorist operations of Ukrainian so-called reconnaissance and sabotage groups, as they claim, but this time there were full armored vehicles columns created, and it was attacks of much larger groups of the military, was a small township of Shebekino, not far from Belgorod, the regional capital of this Russian member of the Russian Federation. And during those attacks, civilian targets were bombed and shelled completely indiscriminately. Local authorities were forced to start evacuation of the civilians. And all in all, in more than about half a dozen of such attempts on different directions and different, so to say, battlegrounds, most of the attackers were either killed on the spot or were pushed out of the Russian territory into the Ukrainian territory, and the shelling and bombing of their positions continued till the complete elimination of those people. But nevertheless, we hear all kinds of speculations, completely ungrounded, having no reasonable explanation that it is not Ukrainian army which is responsible for such attacks. In the West, in some countries like Belgium, for example, recently, some people even expressed their protest that Belgium made, for example, weapons were used in such attacks. Others are cheating and speaking dubiously, like Mr. James Cleverly, about, oh, well, yes, it is not good, but they have their right. So double standards and hypocrisy of perfect quality is widely used in this regard. But we should understand that this is very dangerous escalation of the conflict. And it is continuing from time to time about Novaya Tavalzhanka in the same Belgrade region, in some other places. Yes, maybe it is one of the consequences of certain disorientation, of disorganization of the efforts after that Kinjal hypersonic, very effective missile destroying the headquarters of the military intelligence, Ukrainian military intelligence, which I already mentioned today. But nevertheless, we are sure that all means of all measures to repel such abortive attacks against Russian civilian targets and civilian smaller townships and cities, whatever is their size, will be resolutely prevented from leading to any substantial gains or substantial advantages for the Kiev regime. This is, to my mind, evidently a fact that should be taken into consideration in the West. There is a set of questions which fall a little bit out of the framework of the context of my briefing, though some of them have as well relation to the situation in Ukraine. For example, about our vision of future Ukraine and the Russian-Ukrainian relations after the end of the special military operation. We believe that it is my deep conviction that future of Ukraine will be defined by its own people, like it has already happened in the so-called 5 new Russian entities of federation, members of federation. Unfortunately, the United States and its vassals in Europe are full of resolution to make Ukraine a sacrifice, to sacrifice Ukraine, if you like, for the sake of realization of the geopolitical aims. And evidently this complicates the whole problem of settlement in Ukraine. But only future, with time, we'll have a clearer view of this topic. There is a more definite question, which should be regularly addressed to Romanian officials, not to me, but nevertheless, I would like to preempt maybe some of your new questions and say a couple of words about what should be done for the Russian-Romanian relations, taking into consideration that, for example, problem of the anti-ballistic missile base in Deveselo, it is a problem of Russian-American or Russian-NATO relations. And in the question, the author even claims that even Russian officials are speaking about it. What I can say? I can't recollect any Russian officials authorized to make official statements on the topics, on the issues of foreign policy and international relations, saying anything of this kind. Of course, this base, it is serving the interests of the United States and NATO, for sure. But this is not the issue of our relations with the United States and NATO and nobody else. As far as this base and some other becoming more and more numerous military sites that are emerging now in the Romanian territory. And if you look at the trend of a very dangerous trend of escalation, aggravation of situation around Ukraine, you can make your own conclusions easily. That, in particular, if you follow the logic of Mr. Cleverly, that everybody has the right to strike legitimate targets beyond its borders to defend or to project its force or to defend its own security. Don't forget, it is very authoritative source I have quoted to you. So that is why I believe that this question should be addressed to Romanian leaders. So to say, the ball is at their side of the pitch, not at ours. There is a rather curious question which speaks whether special military operation would lead to speeding up of evacuation of Lenin from mausoleum and so on and so forth, because it was his and Bolsheviks' decisions who created this problem and so on, so to say, and so on and so forth, even quoting Mr. Putin. What I can say in this regard? First of all, I believe that this issue is maybe the last, or maybe the last but one on the list of burning vital issues that we have to deal with now. My personal conviction is, and we see how awful, how barbaric become efforts to destroy historical monuments, military memorials, and so on and so forth, for the sake of nowadays political conjuncture, for the geopolitical aims of certain elites, and so on and so forth. That is why I'm personally against doing anything to mausoleum, because in its present state, this monument was eyewitnessing military parade on the 7th of November, 1941, when German troops were a couple of dozens kilometers from Moscow only. And it was as well a location to which banners and flags of defeated German Nazi divisions from all over Europe were brought and thrown to the foot of the mausoleum by soldiers of Russian army on the 24th of June 1945 in so-called Parade of Victory. So this is my personal conviction. As for the causes and reasons deep in history, it will take us so far from nowadays vital issues and problems that it needs at least a kind of a good scientific you see, brainstorming to find all those reasons and problems. They accumulated, unfortunately, for decades and even centuries. Decisions provided by Lenin and his followers after the October Revolution now looks maybe not very perfect, but I would say that problems started in particular when those people or followers of those politicians and Russian leaders left political scene. So it is a topic for another intellectual exercise, if you like, not our briefing today. Well, another question. Коля. Давай. Another questions are welcome, and we, for some time, are available for new questions, please.
Алло. Добрый день.
Мы слышим вас. Добрый день.
Слышно, да, отлично. Здравствуйте, Валерий Иванович. Прежде всего, поздравляю вас с наступающим праздником национальным. И вопрос. Российско-румынские отношения сейчас практически сведены на нет. Бухарест предпринял в последние годы ряд недружественных шагов по отношению к России, сказал тяжелые слова. И все же дела и слова румынских лидеров, хотя и жесткие, но не такие оголтелые, как в некоторых других странах. Такое впечатление, что они дозируют эти шаги и стараются удержаться в рамках евроатлантической позиции, но не переходить точку невозврата. Вопрос, означает ли это, что румынские власти все же оставляют возможность для нормализации наших отношений в будущем?
Спасибо, Николай Николаевич. Я вас тоже поздравляю с наступающим праздником. Что касается вопроса, то, к сожалению, вот он относится как раз к той категории, которая должны задаваться не нам, а румынским официальным лицам. Вы же сами говорите, что с их стороны она остается приоткрытой. Видимо, они должны решать, надо ли это рассматривать как сохранение таких возможностей. Мы, как я уже говорил в ходе сегодняшнего брифинга, последовательно выступаем за то, чтобы со всеми нашими соседями, со всеми странами Европы, неважно, любого континента, у нас были равноправные, взаимовыгодные прагматические соглашения. Да, я согласен, что отношения российско-румынские последнего периода могут быть рассмотрены, могут восприниматься как несколько более, скажем так, нейтральные, скорее, я бы сказал, да, более корректные, чем нежели с рядом других государств, членов НАТО в первую очередь. Мы это, в общем-то, замечаем, и в этом смысле Румыния вполне может оценить и может в этом смысле при сохранении своей политики в этом плане рассчитывать на нашу взаимность в плане соблюдения норм Венской конвенции о дипломатических сношениях и в рамках поддержания тех отношений, которые возможны с точки зрения, скажем, там, культурно-гуманитарных, чисто человеческих, поскольку у нас существуют люди, десятки, даже, может быть, если посчитать, то и сотни семей, люди с двойным гражданством, смешанные семьи и так далее и тому подобное. Мы это, в общем, понимаем и ценим, и стараемся поддерживать здесь также максимально корректные отношения. Что касается более серьезных, так сказать, стратегических выводов, то я думаю, что сейчас, несомненно, такие выводы делать невозможно просто, даже не просто преждевременно, невозможно. Поскольку, как я постарался сегодня показать, к нашему глубокому сожалению, руководство НАТО и прежде всего лидеры коллективного Запада, как у нас принято теперь говорить в Вашингтоне, совершенно безответственно, не думаю, чтобы, уж даже не понимая рискованности и опасности своего курса, но не осознавая до конца его вполне вероятных катастрофических последствий, продолжает эскалировать ситуацию на Украине. Поэтому все, что зависит от нас, мы сделаем и будем делать. Но тут, как любил высказываться в свое время, в лучшие времена наш министр, для танка нужны двое. Иначе это будет уже что-то другое, типа казачка. Вот. А здесь дело серьезное. Спасибо, я постарался ответить на ваш вопрос. Давай.
Domnul Nicolae Morozov de la agenție TAS l-a întrebat pe domnul ambasador despre relațiile bilaterale între România și Rusia. A menționat că aceste relații aproape nu există astăzi, dar autoritățile române nu sunt atât de dure în relațiile cu Rusia ca alte state membre din NATO, de exemplu, și această ușă pentru relațiile în viitor rămâne puțin deschisă. Domnul ambasador a răspuns că această întrebare trebuie să pusă autorităților române. Rusia întotdeauna este pentru relații bune cu toate țările din lume. Și domnul ambasador confirmă că relațiile între Rusia și România astăzi sunt mai corecte decât cu alte țări din Alianța NATO. Noi vedem aceasta. România poate considera că și Rusia va respecta Convenția de la Viena cu privire la relațiile diplomatice și va, de asemenea, susține și dezvoltarea relațiilor culturale și umanitare. Ceea ce privește alte domenii, din păcate, nu putem să facem nicio concluzie. Cum se spune, pentru tango avem nevoie de două persoane. Mulțumim.
Так, пожалуйста, если нет других вопросов, если есть, прошу, задавайте.
Dacă aveți întrebări suplimentare, vă rugăm să apăsați butonul Ridică mână.
Ну, я могу только поблагодарить вас, поскольку отсутствие дополнительных вопросов расцениваю как то, что наш брифинг был достаточно исчерпывающим, хотя, разумеется, есть что еще сказать и по затронутым темам, есть что еще сказать и по другим. Вот. Но это как-нибудь в следующий раз. А сегодня спасибо всех, кого это касается. Поздравляю с наступающим праздником, Днем России. Благодарю вас за внимание.
Vă mulțumesc frumos pentru participare. Faptul că nu există întrebări suplimentare înseamnă că briefingul nostru a fost complet, adică am reușit să răspund la toate întrebările care vă interesează. Desigur că există mai multe domenii, mai multe teme despre care putem să discutăm, dar poate data viitoare. Vă urez la mulți ani celor care sărbătorează Ziua Rusiei pe data de 12 iunie și vă mulțumesc frumos pentru atenție.